display not working. Issue with the display here. Maybe it'll come up now. So I'm gonna there we go. There we are. It came up. Couple of sort of logistics items. So the third exam is due at midnight tonight if you haven't done that already. I gave you class time last week to do that, so you should be well on your way. If you look at the syllabus, so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about pricing, our products and pricing. And then if you look at the syllabi, there is on the syllabus under the grading, there's something called an article review, which is going to be due at the end of the semester. So next week, you will have time to work on that. For your class period will be to work on the article review. The directions for the article review are found in the orientation and the rubric for it. So if you go to article review assignment, so isn't it nice of me that basically I plan to have the article review workday on the week of Thanksgiving? Isn't that nice? Shake your head. That's fantastic. It's a happy coincidence that that happened. Right? So today we'll talk about products and price. And then next week you will have the class period to work on the article review. Basically what the review tells you to do, and there's obviously a rubric, is that you need to find an article that deals with some issue in ethics and marketing for a company that maybe you're interested in working for or that you're interested in the industry, and then make an argument. Now, the reason I have you do this assignment is that, again, this class is about making arguments, and we make arguments all the time. I tell my sales students that we make arguments in sales every day, in that you're arguing, I should buy a product. If you're a salesperson, you're trying to convince your client that they should buy your product or service, right? Over your competitor's product or service. And so it's important that you learn how to make arguments, and this exercise is designed to do that. It is an argumentative paper. And so you should find something that is an issue in ethics and marketing and make an argument. So I want you to this is not just about providing me with a synopsis of the article. That's important, but it's also about making an argument as to whether or not the company acted ethically or unethically or somewhere in between based on some kind of theory, which is what you've been doing in the essays, in the exams, in this class to this point, but this is sort of an expanded, it's a 3-page length requirement. If you choose an article that's very short, you're probably going to have to choose more than one article in order to get to the length requirement. Yeah.
Do you think is there any like overdone topics that people tend to do over and over again to avoid? Just wondering.
I don't think that there are really. I haven't had a problem with people doing like the same thing over and over again. I think that one of the things that would be really interesting is the impact that AI and AI services are going to have on society would be a really interesting area that has not been done. If you're looking for something that I haven't had anyone do, and it would be pretty interesting if you used AI to generate the article review of the article, and then you critique the review of AI and how well it did on the article review. So that's some way to use AI. For this assignment, if you use AI, that's great. I'm going to reserve the right to say, I think you used AI and I need you to tell me how you came up with this article, what you think, and quiz you about it. I mean, I don't care if you use AI for this. I think it would be worth it to probably see how it works if you haven't tried using AI. But I am going to reserve the right, if I think it's been AI generated, to ask you about it. You know, so be prepared. You might have like a day where you stand up and talk about your article and have to answer questions about the article. Isn't that fun? Yeah, great. Fun for me. I like watching people, you know, sort of sweat as I ask questions. about things that they've done. That's why I became a lawyer. It's all about making people sweat on the stand. I was pretty good at it too. So today we're going to talk about products and price. And in a previous edition of your textbook, they talked about a product called diethylstilbestrol. What this product does, and the reason I use this is I think it's a better example than the current example. It allowed people who had difficulty carrying pregnancies to term to conceive and carry a pregnancy to term. So there are various things that can lead to fertility problems for women. There are women who just can't get pregnant, and that's one problem. And that has largely been dealt with by using artificial insemination or other techniques. But there are women who can get pregnant, but once they do, they have a hard time carrying that pregnancy to term. This is particularly distressful for a lot of people who want to have children and are capable of conceiving, but their body, for whatever reason, will not allow for the carrying of the full term, and so they miscarry. They have a problem with miscarrying. And what this drug, diethylstilbestrol, did was it stopped the body from shedding the uterine wall and allowed these women to carry children to term. Now, years after these women had had children, the daughters of these individuals contracted rare forms of cancer. And some of them died, or they went through, less than pleasant treatment options to cure these rare forms. There's a couple of problems with rare forms of cancer. One is if it's pretty rare and people don't contract it frequently, there's less research on those types of cancer because they have a tendency to focus on cancers that are more prevalent and are, even to this day, difficult to treat. There used to be an ad, and we'll talk about ads next, after Thanksgiving break. We'll talk about the advertising industry, and I'll show you an ad for CTCA, which I think CTCA is no longer in business. There used to be one in Tulsa, but I was very critical of CTCA. I have a cousin who is a researcher. He's a medical doctor and he's what we call a MUD FUD. That's MD, PhD. I'm a JUD FUD. I have a JD, PhD. And he focused on, his research was on pancreatic cancer. If you develop pancreatic cancer, you're probably going to die. There are two types. The most prevalent type, you're probably going to die really, really quickly. The second type, it can go into remission, and there's some treatments. As I understand, I'm not a medical doctor, and they can sort of prolong your life, but you're probably going to die. I mean, nothing is 100% sure, but it's a high probability. Pancreatic cancer is kind of prevalent, more prevalent than some of these cancers that these women, and so they focus on curing those kinds of things. And there isn't, to this day, as I understand it, from my cousin who studies this, there isn't really good treatment options if you're diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. So they've got these rare cancers, and if you've ever cared for anybody who has cancer, it's not a pleasant process, right? I mean, the treatments for cancer basically kill you. That's what chemotherapy does. I mean, it kills the cancer cells. It's also killing good cells because they have a harder time discriminating, and so it's not a pleasant treatment. So these female offspring of these women that took this drug, diethylstilbestrol, come up with these rare types of cancers, and through analysis, they trace it back to this drug. In the 1970s, when I think the drug was developed, we didn't have as good an understanding as we do today of the impacts that drugs have on fetal development. We have a lot more sophistication in terms of what we understand happens with anything that you ingest and the impacts that it can have on your baby. We now have warnings on alcohol and warnings in bars that say, if you consume alcohol while you're pregnant, it may negatively impact your pregnancy. And there's a condition that can be associated with women who drink while they're pregnant. It's called fetal alcohol syndrome. We know that children who are born to mothers that use illegal drugs oftentimes are born horribly addicted to those drugs. But in the 1970s, they didn't understand this as much as they do today. And so they developed this drug to help these women carry their pregnancies to term, and it worked. And they then had children, and some of these children, as a result of exposure to DES, developed cancers. And of course, who are they going to sue? Who are you going to sue if you develop cancer? And it turns out that there's a high statistical probability that it's the result of your mother taking something before you were born. Who are you going to sue?
They don't know the risk, the company. Like if, when the mother was taking it, if they don't know the risk or anything, it was unknown, she thought it was safe, you would sue the company.
Okay? That assumes that the company knew the risk. What is, now, I don't think there's any evidence for this, but what has the Secretary of Health and Human Services said is one of the things that leads to autism?
Oh.
What?
Tylenol.
Yeah, taking Tylenol when you're pregnant. There isn't a lot of evidence for that. I mean, as far as I know, there's not a lot of evidence for that claim. That's, I mean, it's not a lot of evidence for the claim, but if there's some risk that led to it, would you forego taking Tylenol?
Autism isn't cancer, you can live with autism.
Okay. Does it limit a major life function?
Not necessarily. I have people in my family with autism, they live perfectly functioning. I think there's an industry other than
I
the
forgot
whole
to give you,
argument.
I forgot to give you a duck, so grab a duck. Although I think you have more than enough ducks, by the way.
I always do
But
want
by this, I think you have more than enough ducks. Some of the rest of you probably need to get some ducks so that you can get points. Yeah, it's not cancer, but does it limit? I have an autism spectrum disorder. So, yeah, it limited a major life function. I have had to overcome it because I wanted to be a politician. So I have learned how to behave more normally in social settings than is my comfort level. So, should we hold the drug manufacturers responsible? If it turns out the Tylenol does cause or lead to autism, is it possible that autism somewhat is caused by iatrogenesis? That's a condition or disease that is caused by the diagnosis of a physician. We're diagnosing a lot of children with autism right now. Maybe that's the way science works, is we understand things more. So, I don't know. Is it fair to hold the drug companies responsible for this problem that they, in all likelihood, created? But again, in 1970, we didn't have the science to understand that ingesting medication may cross the placenta wall and create these problems. People just didn't think that. People drank and smoked in the 1970s when they were pregnant. They are now putting these warnings about drinking while pregnant in the men's bathroom of bars. And why do you think they're putting these warnings in the men's? I went into a restaurant that had a bar the other day, and they've got this warning, and I'm sitting there thinking, this doesn't impact me. I'm not going to be pregnant. So why? Well, it's because maybe as a father, or you should take, responsibility. Like, holy cow, I didn't know that my insignificant other could experience these issues if she's pregnant. Is it fair to hold the drug companies liable?
You're gonna hold liable if you don't hold the drug companies liable.
But is that fair? I mean, it's one thing to hold people liable. And the reason I use this example is also the other thing, we're gonna talk about pricing today. And pricing, drug costs are a major issue for a lot of the healthcare that we experience in the healthcare costs that we have in this country.
I think up until there is a general warning for the public, I feel like they should, just because they're making a profit on your sickness.
If you read the warning on any drug, would you take it? How many of you read the inserts on any of the drugs that you take? How many of you read them? They're tiny, right? They're written in really small print. They're usually pages and pages long of all the kinds of things that could happen to you. And those are just the known side effects. What about the unknown side effects? You really wouldn't take a lot of drugs if you read the inserts, would you? These GLP-1s have become very, very popular today. They started out so a lot of drugs, one of the things that happens is all drugs have potential side effects. Some of those side effects can be good or positive benefits. Why is it that we have drugs that treat male pattern baldness now? You know how that drug was invented? Finasteride, which is called Propecia for hair loss, was developed for men that had enlarged prostates. And it turns out that they noticed that these men, when they took it, some of these men who were bald started growing hair. So they now prescribe Propecia for hair loss. It was originally developed as a prostate medication. That's a side effect. It's one that happens to be beneficial, but there are other side effects of taking Propecia that can occur. You probably wouldn't take anything if you read the side effects. The diethylstilbestrol case, what are you saying when you sue the drug manufacturer? You're basically saying I shouldn't have been born, aren't you? That's what you're saying. If my mother hadn't taken this drug, I wouldn't have been, I would have been conceived, I probably would not be here. Is like these women developed cancer, it wasn't like when they were babies. It was, as I understand it, in their 20s and 30s, years after their mothers had consumed this drug. Is some life better than never having been born? Is some human life better than never having been conceived? They would have been conceived, they probably would not have been carried to term. When you sue the drug manufacturer, you're saying I should never have been born. In essence, you manufacture this drug and I should never have been born. Is that fair? Most people want to live. Very few people take their own life. I've mentioned this before in a book called Candide, written by Voltaire. If you want to read sort of one of the great works that has a lot of philosophy packed into it, read Candide. It's an anti-novel, actually. So in the novel, I think I've told you this before. Have I talked about Candide in here before? Candide is the main character, the protagonist of the novel, if there's a protagonist in the novel, or the anti-novel. And he gets kicked out of what is sort of a Garden of Eden. He lives in the Kingdom of Westphalia, as I recall. And the Kingdom of Westphalia is run by the Baron Thunder Tanntrunks. Voltaire hated the German language. And so he kind of makes fun of the German language, the Baroness Thunder Tanntrunks. And he comes across Candide and his daughter, Cunigond, and they're in a compromised position, and he literally kicks Candide out of this paradise. We're told that it's the most wonderful kingdom on the planet. It has a castle that even has some windows and some doors. That's how fantastic it is. And Candide literally gets kicked out with powerful kicks on his behind by the Baron out of Westphalia. And he spends the rest of the novel trying to find his beloved Cunigond. And they eventually do reunite at the end, but she's kind of become horrible and termagant. It's a big word. Look it up. But along the way, he meets this woman. He and Cunigond both meet this woman who I've told you before, I think in my talking about this, is the daughter of a pope, but she's become horrible and wretched in her old age. And she was kidnapped by some sailors at one point, and they cut off her right butt cheek in order to survive a shipwreck on an island. And she's sold into slavery, and she goes through all of these things. And she says in this passage in the book, she and Candide and Cunigond are all trying to outdo each other on who's had the more miserable life. And her takeaway is that in spite of all of these troubles that she's had, she went on loving life. She says, is there anything more fatal than to constantly cling to something that you should want to throw away? She says, but I didn't. And in fact, in all of my travels and tribulations, she says, I've only known a handful of people that have voluntarily ended their lives. She lists one of them. She says, she says, there's only been 5. And one of them is a German professor named Robeck. There was in fact a German professor who wrote a named Robeck, who wrote a poem about suicide and then took his own life. What you're saying when you sue the drug company and you win is I should never have been born. Most of us want to live,
To take you out?
you know? I don't know. Prescription drug costs, or since we're going to talk about price, leads to discussions on fairness and who should pay for drugs. So when we talk about these issues, when we talk about product safety, pricing, and ethics issues, we have to think about marketing theory. And I'll just sort of do a brief overview of marketing theory. I think we've talked about this before, but it's good to recall this. There are some basic philosophies in marketing, and I think we talked about this at the beginning of the class when I talked about the combination of ethics and marketing theory. And so the first and oldest theory of marketing, which has existed, so marketing as an activity, I told you, I think before, has existed since the beginning of human societies. We know that there was a time before society occurred. Man lived in a state of nature and probably in very small groups. Primitive man, prehistoric man. But at the point we become historic and we think of ourselves as distinct and separate from the cosmos, we see societies emerge, and in those societies, marketing as an activity had to take place. You had to have specialization of labor, specialization in the division of labor, because man is not by nature a very powerful creature. What has allowed us to survive? We're pretty fragile. And what has allowed us to survive? I mean, are we the strongest animal on earth? No. Like, you know, the ability, like, if we look at just pound for pound, what's the strongest animal on earth?
Gorilla.
The gorilla? It's actually not.
Hippopotamus.
I don't think it's the hippopotamus.
Elephant.
I don't think it's the, those are like, yeah, they've got a lot of strength, but they've got they've got huge amounts of mass. I think actually like
Lion.
something like the Tasmanian devil
Oh.
is, I think, the strongest pound for pound. I may be wrong on that. Somebody look it up.
I'll look it up.
I think it's the Tasmanian devil, pound for pound. Or maybe it's the, I think
Strongest.
it may have like, I think at one time I read somewhere like, if you include ants,
Dung beetle.
the dung beetle is the strongest. I mean, they have an enormous amount of ability to lift, what? How many times their body weight? Ants can lift
1,141 times its own weight.
its own weight. Wow. Okay, that's pretty impressive. For anybody who goes to the gym and lifts, if you can bench, you know, like twice your body weight, that's an impressive feat, right? So that's really impressive. But in terms of just actual strength, yeah, I mean, elephants have far more strength. Lions have far more strength than we do. Do we have the best vision? No. Best hearing? No. Best vision probably goes to some raptor. They can spot something in a field moving, you know, from way up in the air, right? So we come together and we form societies, and that's what's allowed man to survive, because we're a fairly fragile creature compared to some of these others in the animal world. And so you have this philosophy called the production philosophy. If you build it, they will come, right? And for most of human history, this philosophy was the dominant philosophy in marketing. If you build something, if it's at all useful, people will buy it. Then in the Industrial Revolution, we get the sales philosophy. That's where, for the first time in human history, we have the ability to produce more than just what we need. For most of human history, we produced basically what we needed and not a whole lot of excess. But with the Industrial Revolution, we start producing massive amounts of stuff in excess. We start being able, why is the world's population exploded? Well, for most of human history, famine prevented the explosion of the human population. We now have the ability to produce way more food than we need. I remember I was in, I think, graduate school for the first time in human history when I remember reading this article, the number of obese people in the world exceeded the number of people that were starving to death. And that's only gotten more lopsided as we have radically changed the ability to produce food. Now, going back to this diethylstilbestrol, we can produce something that will allow people to carry. What about less obvious things? Should we be able to sue McDonald's? Turns out McDonald's food is pretty addictive. You all might not think so because you have the luxury of maybe not having food insecurity. And so McDonald's is not necessarily the most wonderful food, but it turns out, why is it highly addictive? Well, what makes food good? Fat, right? There's a cook who's written a book, something like Salt, Acid, Fat, Heat. Those are the things that make, McDonald's has all of those. Got a lot of salt, a lot of fat, maybe not so much acid. And heat, by heat they mean, things like capsaicin. Those are all highly addictive. Like, we want to eat. Why is McDonald's so addictive? McDonald's fries are like the perfect combination of salt and fat. Now, they used to be better. When I was a kid growing up, McDonald's fries were actually a little bit better than they are today. They're still really good if they're fresh. They're not as good as they were when I was a kid growing up in the 1970s and 80s. Why were they better in the 1970s and 80s? They used beef tallow in the frying oil, which made it just a little bit better. Made it highly addictive, but they're still pretty good. So we get the sales philosophy, which is, right, we're gonna start selling stuff. We're gonna start marketing things like diethylstilbestrol. You got a problem, we're gonna solve the problem. We're gonna sell you that product. As we progressed, we get the marketing philosophy. This is where marketing becomes a science. We go from just being a practitioner discipline to being one that we can study, and we begin to study the consumers in ways to figure out what it is. We now can produce way more than we need. Well, we can differentiate our products along various lines and become even more sophisticated in that. We get the marketing philosophy. And then finally, we get the relationship philosophy, or what we call value co-creation, where we're not only studying the consumer, but we're actually making them a part of the team. What I try to do in this class is engage in value co-creation. I look at you, I watch you, and see whether or not you're responding. I've done the ducks to make sure that you have to kind of participate in class. And so with these various philosophies used to market goods like diethylstilbestrol, we now have the ability to really start producing goods that not only do we not need, that may be harmful for us. Now, again, it's a debate. with diethylstilbestrol as to whether or not that harm outweighs the positive benefits. How do you measure that from a utilitarian perspective? What you're basically saying when you sue the drug company and you say you manufactured a defective product that's led to me getting cancer is I should never have been born. Most people, not me, I had never wanted children. I think I told you that my wife said she didn't want children either, and after we got a divorce, she had 5. So she didn't want to have children, which is fine because I didn't want to have children, so that's okay. Yeah. Most people want to have kids. For most people, that is one of the greatest joys that they will ever have, is having children. It's sort of human nature to want to make little mini-me's. Again, not for me. That's probably part of my autism spectrum disorder. I just don't have that need. Don't need to be that connected to anybody. I don't really like to be connected to people. I can tolerate most people for about 50 minutes. And after that, peace out. How do you weigh that? How do you weigh, like, you had life, you lived to be 35, let's say, versus not. And it brought probably an enormous amount of joy to your parents. Because again, most people, this is one of the things. I used to have students in my American National Government class, when I used to teach that class, write a paper called My American Dream. And what's part of the American Dream? And I've told you all this is very unusual. No other country does this. Nobody, when I was a foreign exchange student in Germany, ran around saying, my German dream. But we do in America. We say, my American dream. And most people, their American dream is to have kids. It's part of it. Get married, have a family, buy a house. The Trump administration is trying to make housing more affordable since housing has become really, really crazy expensive. What are they trying to do? What's their solution to that?
50-year.
50-year mortgage. A 50-year mortgage. Wow. Is that a good idea?
You wanna
If you wanna
pass
be an
your
indentured
mortgage on
servant.
in the will, like,
What?
here's the house, it's the mortgage along with it.
Nobody thought a 30-year mortgage, nobody thought a 30-year mortgage was a terribly good idea. Is it? At the time that FDR proposed it, that nobody thought that was a terribly good idea. At least you're probably gonna live, although people don't stay in mortgages for, I've lived in my home, the home that I own, for 38 years. Crazy. How long do most people stay in their home in the United States?
Not that long.
Less than 10.
5 years. 5. Something like 5 years. Why is that? Because we're addicted to stuff. Have you ever noticed somebody else's stuff is crap? Move your crap so I can set my stuff here. When we build monuments to our stuff, it's called our house. And when we fill that up, we don't get rid of our stuff. We buy a bigger house so we can get more stuff. So how do you weigh this, right? During the production era, most of the stuff we produced, we needed. Once we get into these other areas, we're now producing stuff that we don't need. Nobody needs an urban assault vehicle, but we all want one, particularly everyone in Edmond, the land of the shallow and pretentious people. They all think that they have to drive these urban assault. What do I mean by an urban? Cadillac Escalade.
Everybody has one.
Everybody's gotta have a Cadillac Escalade. Why? Why do they need a Cadillac? I mean, most of these people live in houses that they're not hauling anything other than kids in that Cadillac Escalade. Do you really need that? No. Lincoln, but we want it. So once we get into these, the production philosophy, for most of the human history, we just kind of produced enough to sustain life. Now we've got all of this stuff, right? Which leads to lots of issues with product safety. And through the course of Anglo-American jurisprudence, we have moved on this issue of product safety from a theory of caveat emptor. So the oldest theory in Anglo-American jurisprudence, which has a lot of ethical import, is called caveat emptor, which means let the buyer beware. In other words, if you are stupid enough to buy something, well, and it hurts you, it's your responsibility. What's the problem with that? Well, for most of human history and for most of Anglo-American jurisprudence, under this doctrine of caveat emptor, most people could sort of inspect the goods that they were buying and have some idea. If you went back in time to the beginning of the 20th century, so 1900, not that long ago, how did most people get around? So 125 years ago, which is in the course of human events, if we think of the world history as being a 24-hour clock, you're talking about just a few minutes before midnight, right? 125 years ago, how did most people, well, they got around by a horse and buggy. How was Oklahoma settled? In 1889, we were settled in a land run. This part of the state was settled in a land run. And people ran on horseback primarily. There's a great statue of our historic development down in Bricktown. How many of you have seen it's 1.5 size life size. So it's bigger than the average person, bigger than the average horse by 1.5 times. And you can see it down on the river walk down there, right south and west of Bass Pro. At the end of, if you take the gondola ride or whatever it is, those boats that'll go along the canal, the river walk, you come to this statue that's at the end of that. So not that long ago, I mean, when I moved to Guthrie in 1986, there were people I knew people whose parents had come in the land run. Not so much anymore. Most of those people are dead. They died, but they came in the land run. People rode in horses and buggies, and you could probably inspect that fairly easily. You could tell whether the horse was sway back, whether or not it had poor feet and was going to be problematic. Can you reasonably inspect your car and know whether or not it's going to kill you in this day and age? No, probably not. They've become highly sophisticated, very dangerous pieces of equipment. And as a result, we've done everything we can to make them safer. Take, for example, have I told you about the case of Willie Searcy and Ford? Ford versus Searcy. Have I talked about that case in here?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody remembers this case?
I don't think you talked about it.
So Willie Searcy's riding in the front seat of his stepfather's Ford F-150 pickup truck. The Ford F-150 is what? For 30 years running, anybody know?
The #1 truck
The
sold.
number one selling truck in America. And actually, I think now the number, because everybody thinks, again, that they have to have a pickup truck. Why? Do most people, like my father who owns a cattle ranch, absolutely hates all of you people who have no, tie to farming and are driving a pickup truck. Why do you drive it? It's cool, right? You're up off the ground. It's got some utilitarian function in that you've got a bed, so you can put stuff in that bed that you're never going to put in the bed. But lots of people, I I'm fascinated by driving around the apartments in Edmond and seeing how many people who live in these apartments drive pickup trucks. Do you need a pickup truck? You don't need a pickup truck. He drops something on the floor and his stepdad tells him to pick it up. As he's going to pick it up, his father slams into the back, or his stepfather slams into the back of another car. The tension regulator on the shoulder harness, which is far more reliable and far safer than the seatbelts. When I was a kid, seatbelts would hold you in the car, but they were lap belts, which meant that you were probably going to die anyway. It just kept your body from being thrown out of the car. If you slammed into somebody, you were probably going to slam into the windshield, which is what happens to Willie Searcy because he's placing constant tension on the seatbelt shoulder harness, and there's a tension regulator which snaps into place and holds that belt secure if it feels a sudden burst of energy. But if you're going forward at just the right moment that you slam into another car, maybe that tension regulator won't catch. And that's what happens. And as a result, the lap belt holds him in place, but it allows him to slam into the front windshield of that car and he becomes a quadriplegic. Who are you going to sue? Ford. Because that product is defective. So we went from a theory of caveat emptor, which is let the buyer beware, to one where we're saying, maybe that's not so fair because we can't really evaluate. Can you evaluate? Are you capable of evaluating the health benefits or effects of diethylstilbestrol? No. You can't even really evaluate. Diethylstilbestrol is a very complex chemical drug that the way that they came up with whether or not this works is far more complex than, say, a tension regulator in the Ford F-150 seatbelt. And we can't even evaluate that. How many of you would have the ability to take apart the seatbelt and say, well, this just isn't very safe? No one in this room. So we move from a theory of caveat emptor where we let the buyer beware to one of negligence. As we move from production to sales and marketing, we now start saying, well, you have a duty to reasonably manufacture something that is reasonably safe for the ordinary purpose to which it is going to be put. Now, what does that mean? Well, what did I do today? Because the camera refused to, I don't know why it always goes, it moves, obviously, because every time I come in here, it's moved back and it's focused on the door and it will not follow. In every other classroom, it picks up movement and it follows me, but I had to get on top of a chair and physically move it so that we could record today's class. This is a chair. It is manufactured to be sat in. Does anybody just sit in chairs? What I did is what's pretty common. People use chairs all, and this is dangerous, inherently dangerous, which is why I'd be willing to bet we could look and there's a warning label on the chair that says things like what? Don't stand on the chair, right? Because this is really dangerous to stand on, particularly since it has wheels, because it'll like fly right out from under you. But if you use it in the purpose into which it is intended, which is to sit in, it should be reasonably, I think it's reasonably safe. It's not, nobody's breaking the chair, we're not falling through the chair and becoming injured, right? You shouldn't do what? You shouldn't what a lot of us do. It's hard to do in these chairs because they've got, again, casters on them. But when I was a kid, they didn't put casters on chairs in school. You had just chairs that had, 4 legs. And what do you do when you have just 4 legs and no casters? These chairs lean kind of back. Those chairs didn't. So you rock back and forth. Is that? And so there's going to be a warning label, I'm going to guess, on the chair that says, don't do that, right? Keep all 4 feet on the floor. So we move to a theory of negligence, which says you have a duty to manufacture things in a reasonably safe manner. You breach the duty. That breach of the duty causes injury, and there is legal causation of that injury, which is generally determined by the but-for test, but that doesn't always work. So in a case called Falls Graft versus the Rock Island Railroad, I think, I know it's Fallsgraph, I can't remember which railroad company it was. They talk about this idea of proximate cause, right? Which is that if something is too attenuated, we're not gonna hold somebody liable. What happens in that case is, did I talk about this case before? The Fallsgraph case in here? I can't remember sometimes from semester to semester if I brought these things up, so I apologize that I keep asking if I've talked about it, but I don't wanna repeat myself too much. In that case, there's a guy who's carrying a package, and it turns out that the package has got explosives in it. He's running to catch a train, and he's running down the platform. His train is pulling out, and he jumps on the train, and as he does, he's about to fall backward, and so a conductor for the railroad gives him a little shove to get him on the train. And he drops, as a result of that little shove, the package that he's carrying, which contains explosives, TNT, and it causes a reverberation to the other end of the platform where there's a set of scales that are hanging on the wall that fall and hit Mrs. Fallsgraph in the head. Now, but for the act of the railroad conductor pushing him on the train, Mrs. Fallsgraph wouldn't have been hurt because he probably wouldn't have dropped the package. But the court says, if we use a but-for test, yeah, but for the actions of the railroad, she might not have been hurt. But who would reasonably foresee the fact that some guy running late for a train would be carrying a package of explosives, jump on the train, start to fall back, be pushed, drop the package, and cause an explosion? That's too attenuated. Now, if we apply this logic to diethylstilbestrol, at the time in the 1970s, you wouldn't hold the drug companies liable, would you? No. Because who would have foreseen in the 1970s that a drug that you gave a woman to have her, allow her to carry her pregnancy to term, would then cross the placenta and 35 years later cause injury to her daughter in terms of cancer? That's not reasonably foreseeable, is it? No. That's way, way crazy. But yeah, we do it. How do we establish liability? Strict products liability. You no longer have to have reasonably foreseeable. You no longer have to take the duty of care. I mean, you have to take the duty or you're going to be found guilty under negligence. You're going to be found responsible or liable under a theory of negligence. But this drug, diethylstilbestrol, was manufactured to the best science of the day. That's all you can demand of people. But now we come up with one that's more, we say, strict product. If you hurt anybody by your product, whether you manufactured it with the duty of care or not, you're going to be liable. And we see this in the drug cases all the time, right? Talcum powder, manufactured by Johnson & Johnson, they're holding them liable for things that nobody thought that would cause cancer 20 years ago. Nobody would have foreseen that. Well, what's the theory that supports strict products liability? So negligence is clearly a duty theory, right? You have a duty. We're going to impose a duty legally on you. What does strict products liability rely on? It's purely utilitarian. Pure utilitarian. All you're saying is it doesn't matter. We're not saying you're a bad person, you're a bad company. It's just who's in the better position to pay. Who's in the better position to pay for Willie Searcy's care after he slams into, I mean, who would have foreseen this exact fact pattern? Normally, the tension regulator would catch, because what happens in an accident is you have a sudden pressure on the shoulder harness. But at the last minute, you got this kid that's going forward, and because there's just enough pressure on that shoulder harness, it doesn't catch the tension regulator. So it's what we call a design defect. But nobody would have reasonably foreseen that. It worked the way it would work normally and the way it was designed to work in 99.99999% of the cases. Because in 99% of the cases, what are you doing? Are you sitting forward, putting pressure? And even if you were sitting forward and putting pressure, if you had stopped, it was the fact that there was a constant slow pressure immediately before the point of impact that led to this result. Strict products liability is purely utilitarian. Who's in the better position to pay? Ford or Willie Searcy's stepfather? Ford. Ford is a multi-trillion-dollar company. They're in a better position to pay. Pure utilitarianism. Now, what happens is people start saying we need to have tort reform because of this doctrine, because people are getting huge judgments and it's affecting business. The problem with tort reform is that it impacts the most injured party. So what people like George W. Bush, when he was governor of Texas, argued is that tort reform was necessary to avoid frivolous lawsuits. The problem with that is that when you have tort reform and you limit liability, you are affecting the most injured party. If you have somebody who has a truly frivolous lawsuit and the jury awards them one dime in damages, they have been overcompensated for that injury, right? If it's truly a frivolous lawsuit. What you're doing is you're taking the most damaged person and limiting their ability to recover. You're taking Willie Searcy's ability to live for the rest of his life and limiting the amount of recovery that he can have. Ethics and pricing. We generally have a free market idea in this country, but it's not absolute, right? If we had absolutely free market, we would end up with things like monopolistic pricing, where this is happening in lots and lots of industries where the number of players in that industry are severely limited. Why? Because the barriers to entry are pretty great. And so you end up with people being able to charge. This is what happened with Standard Oil. They went in and they would say, we want to buy your oil company. If somebody said they're not going to sell their oil company, Standard Oil would go across the street. They would cut the prices until they put that other firm out of business. And then they would raise the prices and you end up with a monopoly. And we generally say that's bad. So we don't have a totally free market economy, because if you did, you could have monopolistic pricing. What is price fixing? Price fixing is not where you have a monopoly, but you have so few players that you can get together, like the airlines, for example. If they did this, I'm not saying that they do, but if they did, there are how many airlines? Not a lot. Less than 12, less than a dozen. They could fix rates. And we generally say that that's bad. And we have laws that limit the ability to price fix. Right? What is price gouging? Well, price gouging is where you take advantage of something like a natural disaster. What happens when there's a hurricane in Florida? Everybody runs out to buy plywood. And if you had purely free market economics, Lowe's and Home Depot and all those other places could charge exorbitant rates for plywood and sandbags and things like that. And we generally say you can't do that. And finally, there's predatory pricing. Predatory pricing occurs where you, for example, in the subprime mortgage industry, go out and you entice people into buying something that they really can't afford. What was that? Well, again, the average home is lived in for about 5 years and people sell it. Now, that average is actually going up as a result of the fact that people can no longer afford the mortgages. But before, what was happening was people were, when they deregulated the mortgage industry and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac lost all their power to set the rules, they started making loans to people who really couldn't afford them based on stated income. In the past, before we had the deregulation of the housing market, you had to have a fully documented loan. What did that mean? Well, it meant that if you wanted to get a mortgage, your bank was going to go and they were gonna verify your income. How did they do that? Well, you had to give them your income tax returns and you had to provide them with wage statements. And then they would actually call your employer and say, how likely is it that you're going to be employed here, for the foreseeable future? Now, for someone like me, that's pretty easy because I've been here since I was 22 and I have tenure, which means what?
Means you
It's
stay.
hard to get rid of me. But that really limits the ability. If you have to have that kind of security, that can limit the ability. Well, so we did away with that in order to try and open up the home market to more and more people. You could state income. You could lie about your income. And that meant that banks and home mortgage brokers were selling people loan products that they didn't understand and could not afford. That's predatory pricing. We generally say that that's not a good thing either and is not allowed even in a capitalistic society. These issues are really complex. I think diethylstilbestrol is one of the ones that highlights how complex they are in a way that most people can understand. Because it provides you with this, are you better off having the drug than not having the drug? But having said that, you've now caused this person to have this injury. You've made profits off the drug. Should you have to disgorge some of those profits in order to provide for the results that have occurred? Context in these is highly relevant. So a lot of what we've talked about in this class is highly theoretical, but this is where theory actually meets practice. And context is going to be critical in all of these cases. And finally, I think one of the things that we get when we talk about product development and pricing is we understand sort of the integrated nature of marketing. We think of the 4 Ps oftentimes when we teach them as though they're separate and distinct ideas, but they're all interrelated. You cannot bring a product to market unless you can get a price that allows you to stay in business. And what are we doing when we allow for strict products liability, for example? We are foisting that price off on basically everybody else because companies really don't pay prices. They will figure that into the cost of goods sold. If I'm going to be held liable for trillions of dollars, what am I going to do when I bring a new drug to market? I'm going to price that drug really, really high to deal with the liability that I may face, which means that a lot of us won't have access to that drug. This has happened with the GLP-1s. They were originally developed for diabetics, right? And so we see this being used, and then they notice that there's this side effect of these drugs, which is some of these diabetics lose weight. Now, I'll tell you what, with the GLP-1s, turns out that you lose more weight if you're not a diabetic. But some of the diabetics lost weight on these drugs. And so they've now, again, happy coincidence, started prescribing them off-label for weight loss. And it seems to be fairly effective, right? Which leads to ideas about promotion, which we'll talk about next time, and placement. Should you place these drugs where they can be seen by everybody? Should we promote them in ways? We're the only country, and we'll talk about this when we talk about advertising, that allows direct-to-consumer advertising of pharmaceutical products. No other country except New Zealand, but the other ones that allow this. So I hope you guys have a good Thanksgiving next week. You'll work on your article reviews, and we will come back the week after that. We'll have 1 week of class. We'll talk about product advertising and placement issues, and that will sort of conclude the course for this semester. So if you haven't finished the exam, be sure and finish it by midnight tonight, and I will try to get those graded as quickly as I can. And I will see you after Thanksgiving. Have a good Thanksgiving break.